greater than 50%. And I compared them to housing prices in neighborhoods where the prices of homes or the Black population was less than 1%. And I controlled for education, crime, walkability, all those fancy Zillow metrics, so I could get an apples-to-apples comparison of home prices. And what I found astounding, that homes in Black neighborhoods are devalued by 23%, about $48,000 per home. Cumulatively, that amounts to about $156 billion in lost equity. Now, we know that people use equity to lift themselves up. That money should go toward folks to start a business or to send their kids to college. It could have funded actually more than 8 million college degrees based on the average price of a public college tuition. It could have funded more than 4 million startup businesses. But that money is essentially extracted by the perception of the neighborhood that reduces the value. Now, certainly that occurs in appraisals, it occurs in lending practices, it occurs in real estate agent behavior and the overall economy as well. But it's clear that if you can, from our research, that if you take a home in a Black neighborhood and place it in a white one, it increases in value by nearly $50,000. And that's essentially a metaphor for how we live today in America.
Wow. And there's an interesting chapter that you recently mentioned in the webinar hosted by the Brookings Institute titled, "Having Babies Like White People." The title I thought was pretty riveting because we know that infant mortality and postpartum death is highest among Black women. What is the link between that and community devaluation, and why was that chapter important to you?
Yeah, there's this long-standing narrative that the conditions of Black cities are a direct result of the individual behaviors of the people in them. And how that pertains to birth and birthing. A lot of people look at the disparities in birthing outcomes, and they say, hey, look, what are you eating? Look at your diet. You have diabetes and all these other issues. But they miss the fact that it's really the structures of employment, of criminal justice, of education, all these different things influence. One, they influence your health, but they have a large bearing on the amount of stress, the amount and overall outcomes on people's lives. So when we start saying, hey, start pointing the finger at mothers and saying, hey, you have to stop eating this and stop drinking that, we're missing the influence of the environment. And why that's important to me, my wife, who is a physician, we struggled to have a child. And I have fell in that trap as well, criticizing what she was eating, criticizing her exercise habits. So we all fall in that trap. But eventually we did have a child, and it took a lot of resources. Luckily, we had the financial means, and we eventually had a gestational carrier to have our child. But that shouldn't have happened. One, we should eliminate the structural racism, and you shouldn't have to be wealthy in order to have these treatments. And so the title of that chapter, Having Babies Like White People, was actually a response from a relative when they found out how we were having a child. They say, wow, you've really made it. You're having babies like white people. But the reality is that we should not have structural racism that suppresses birthing outcomes. We should not blame mothers for those outcomes. And more importantly, we should have programs and initiatives like they do in the UK, for instance, that allow coverage for fertility treatments.
There are many, many reoccurring themes throughout your book. It's a fantastic book. Regardless of the Black, city mentioned, the recipe for ignoring it or participating in its demise seems to be the same. How can we move beyond devaluation and get back on track to try to move society past this track that it's in?
One, it really does take investments in people. The interesting thing about housing is that if we invested in homes, if we invested in businesses, and if we invested in these good assets, you'll see a return. but we don't invest in them, and so you don't get the return. The point of showing devaluation is to say, hey, these are strong assets. They're not broken. They're just devalued. So we have to go back to investing in these things. An interesting study that my colleague Jonathan Rothwell at Gallup and David Harshbarger at Brookings did, we looked at businesses in Black communities. And what we found, similarly, we scraped Yelp data to get a sense of quality of businesses all across the country. And what we found that businesses in Black neighborhoods owned by people of color actually score higher on Yelp than their white counterparts, but they get less revenue. That's because folks are not going towards Black neighborhoods. But what we are seeing in this COVID moment, people are calling these businesses, they're calling the Black-owned restaurant, the Jamaican spot, the Ethiopian spot, the soul food spot, and having it delivered. And so they recognize the quality, but and under normal circumstances, they're not going to these businesses. Now our elders used to say that our ice is just as cold, because they knew if you don't go to quality, you distort the market in a way that suppresses the economic mobility of the people living in the neighborhood. And so our ice is just as cold. The Black business owners, Black homeowners, renters, they don't need some kind of program to build themselves up. They just need the investment. Now, we've been down this road before. You remember during the Depression, how we got out of the Depression, we invested in poor people. We just excluded Black people from the New Deal, from major parts of the New Deal. The same thing is true today. If we want to get out of this pandemic, the recession, and deal with the underlying causes that hurt Black folk, we have to invest in the people as well as the communities in which they live.
Most definitely. I couldn't agree with you more, and I think your book does a really good job of showing that. Thank you so much again for coming on. Once again, Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities. Andre Perry, thank you so much for coming on, sir.
Hey, thanks for having me.
All right, everybody, that is our show for you today. Remember, in this world,